Hi, my name is Paul Arnold, sometimes known as the Stuttering Professor. I'm a strategic planner, facilitator, trainer, amongst other things. And as you can see, I've read loads of books, and I do hasten to add I've not read all of these. Now, I've summarised over 50 business-related books, and today I want to talk about this, Obliquity by John Kay, why our goals are best achieved indirectly. And I remember I first read this because it was like one of the top books recommended by CEOs, so that was what was on their reading list. Now, in a nutshell, the book is in essence built around the principles of complexity and systems theory. And it suggests that we are not totally rational in our decision making. All the work's done by Damasio, etc., have proven that. And hence rational approaches do not always work, especially if the situation is complex. And we falsely believe that the optimal route to a quality decision is to evaluate all the options and then implement the best one. It'll take forever to achieve that. But the world is just too complex for this to work in reality. We never have complete information, and we cannot control all aspects. Thus any decision we make has resultant consequences that change the system. We are inside the system, we're not outside of it. And so therefore sometimes what we do creates a knock-on effect and creates a knock-on effect. So in such complex environments, Kay suggests we're better to iterate towards a solution, constantly adapting to the changing environment rather than devising some grand strategy and plan. So let's now dig into more of the meat of the book and some of the key principles. One of the key principles is myth of rationality, which we've already touched on. In this idea, we're not totally rational in our decision making, and we're often unconsciously influenced by seemingly irrelevant information, hence the whole birth of behavioural economics. Now, computing power has seduced us into the belief that we can now measure and assess all options, but the number of possible actions and responses available in a complex situation soon outstrips even the most advanced computers. Now, bear in mind this book was written pre, the dawn of AI. That may have now changed, but still, complexity means it's a very tricky situation to rely totally upon computers to work out what is the perfect answer. And just because we can measure something does not mean it's relevant and important. That famous Einstein quote, "Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted," feels so true here. Furthermore, we over-rely on models that simplify a complex situation and suggest a mechanistic response, almost that the world we're living in is like some engineering machine that is consistent and easy to control. And as we know, as soon as you bring people in, that model, that metaphor just completely goes out the window. Thus, it's a false belief that a totally rational approach leads to the best decisions. Yet we live in a culture that values rational decision making. That's what most organisations are built upon. We like to be Spock-like, and it's a myth that that's how we actually make many decisions. And Kay criticises those who fall into what he calls Franklin's gambit, finding evidence to support our conclusion. Obliquity instead is the more common route to successful outcomes. When he looks about how companies actually get to where they get to, how they're successful, he says they take this oblique path. So in reality, we rarely achieve our goals through a direct path, but more commonly through a more oblique approach, both on a personal and a professional basis. Also, many discoveries come about through sort of happenstance, through obliquity, such as penicillin and the theory of relativity. Furthermore, many advances are made through gradual evolution and development rather than through a revolutionary master plan, as I already talked about. He talks in the book about the airplane development as taking place over many, many years, with individuals sort of inching stuff forward. The definition of obliquity is the process of successfully achieving complex objectives indirectly. Now, why is this? Because we live in complex environments, in complex systems. And our environments are in constant flux. We're in a dynamic system with many influencing factors. And people are irrational decision makers, and hence we do not act consistently. And the more people who are involved, within a system, the more possible outcomes can occur. 2 people, slightly more controllable, 20,000 people, impossible. And also, objectives are rarely clear cut, and they often change. And the problem is very difficult to really sort of, clarify and say it's just this one element. It's usually a multifactorial problem we're dealing with. And the other thing is we can't be outside the system. We are in the system, and you are affected and affect other elements of the system. Every action you put in will be able to affect the system and will change the dynamism of the system you are in. Therefore, problems are rarely solved in one go, and often solving one problem, therefore, creates a secondary problem, and we've got to deal with that. And then that, trying to solve that, leads to a third problem, etc., etc. Thus, it's impossible to be in total control. Now, many leaders come unstuck with the belief in their omnipotence, in their agency and their power in that space. Furthermore, no one person holds all the answers, has the complete definition of the truth. And basically, at the end of the day, what a leader needs to go and do is to actually make the strategy happen through using multiple people within the system, because everyone's got some angle on the truth that needs to be identified. It's also difficult to come up with the perfect solution because there is rarely one perfect answer that solves all the interlinking issues. Thus, the notion of one best solution is misguided, because there is rarely total information available. Furthermore, when one has devised the perfect rational solution, assuming it exists, in reality, it's almost impossible to execute. As people do not respond consistently or logical, they are emotionally driven, and therefore they'll not do what you want them to go and do. And strategy does not equal outcomes, as our decisions impinge on and depend on the responses of others. So what we do will change things. So what happens in oblique decision making? The first thing is there is an acceptance of the complexity of a situation. Accept there will never be complete information. Accept that they are not in total control of the situation, and therefore they accept they must be flexible and adapt to the changing, evolving situation that they are in their own way influencing. Furthermore, they don't try to assess all options to come up with a grand master plan. They only assess a few options, and then they dive into the problem. They get inside the problem, inside the issue, because that's the only way you're really going to understand it. And then when inside it, they make constant successive adaptations to that changing dynamic environment that they're in. And consequently, they adapt, evolve, and iterate their way to their desired outcome. They've always got their North Star. But they accept that, as Charles Lindblom described it, as the science of muddling on through. And as I said, they accept that the problem solution will adapt as they start working on it. You know, to quote Goodhart's law, responses changes the nature of the problem itself. But they keep focused on the end vision of where they're trying to get to. But a bit like on a surfboard, they're flexible and creative in how they get there. And they recognise their own limitations and have the courage to switch strategies if it's not working. As Roosevelt once said, try something. If it fails, admit it frankly, move on and try something else. And therefore they accept that no one person has all the answers, and that a realistic working solution involves both central as well as local information. And they're open to serendipity. You know, talks in the book about the success of Honda in the States wasn't some grand master plan. It came about more by happenstance. They had this little step through C70, and just that Salesforce realised is a very quick and cheap, easy way for their salesmen to get around. So it took off by chance rather than the plan. So, critic of the book. Look, overall, I really buy into this concept. You know, I've always loved the idea of wicked problems, about the complexity of problems, and how you really need to enter the problem to find the way out of it. Now, clearly, as most books do, you can say he falls into Franklin's gambit as well, because he's finding the evidence to support his conclusions. Well, you're bound to do that anyway. And, you know, there's a key theme that gets pushed out time and time again in the book, you know. But look, overall, what I would say, I think is a really important book, particularly in these more VUCA times, and I highly recommend it. So I hope that helps.